Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We are continuing our discussion of the Quran, chapter 4, verse 34. And Dr. Shabir, we've already looked at classical interpretations of the verse, how different people have translated and understood the verse. And then we've looked at some modern interpretations as well. And now we want to look at how you understand the verse. And I understand you have your own unique take on it, which you're going to share with us now.
Yes. So first of all, I should, answer the question of why come up with a new interpretation? Because if the classical interpretations are already there, why would you change that which is good? So my simple answer to that is that the classical interpretations actually have been proven to be not satisfactory to people in modern times. And that's why we have had so many modern attempts, many different attempts to give many different approaches to this verse. And then the second question is, why don't I take one of those approaches? And I've already explained in the previous segment that I find each one of them unsatisfactory for this reason or the other. I don't want to repeat all of that now, but now with that sort of justification, let me proceed. But another important aspect of this, Safiya, is, folks might be wondering, okay, so who are you to come up with your own interpretation or a new interpretation? So I don't consider myself to be anyone special, but I believe that we all have a responsibility to represent the Book of Allah in a proper way so that we don't misrepresent Allah. We don't want to tell somebody, God says this, and they're saying, what kind of God is that? We need to represent God properly. Now, if he did say something, and we're sure that this is what he said, it doesn't matter even if the whole world disagrees, we still hold on to what God said, because that's God after all. He is right, even if everybody else is wrong. But if something could mean this way or that way, and we're putting it one way and people are objecting to that, we should look at the other way as well and see if that's viable. If it's not viable, we go back to what we've always been saying, and we insist upon it regardless of who disagrees. But we have to see if there is a viable alternative. And then, not everyone can just simply come up with, can say, I'm an interpreter of the Quran, because to interpret the Quran requires mastery of certain disciplines. To begin with, one has to know the whole history of the interpretation of the Quran, to know what the classical commentators said, why they said it, to see how they expounded the Arabic terms, because especially if one is not a native Arabic speaker, and even if one is a native Arabic speaker, one still has to go back to the classical commentators to see how the terms were explained in the classical context, to what the term used to mean, because terms can change and vary with time. Like sayyara, it could mean like a person traveling by sea at the time of the Quran, but nowadays sayyara means a car. So it's a same term, different meaning. So one has to know what the classical meanings and so on. So what I can say in my own defense is that, I did take it seriously. I studied the classical tradition. I studied the modern interpretations, a wide variety of them. I try to read everything I can get my hands on. And I did take the study seriously in pursuing a PhD, especially in the field of Quranic exegesis, which is the interpretation of the Quran. And because I did that study in a secular university, it's not a university that teaches me how to expound the Quran in a Muslim sense. It's teaching me how to understand the whole field of Quranic exegesis. It's actually, in a way, equipped me to see the whole matter in a holistic way, and to see developments and trends, and to understand who said what and why they said what they said, given the social context and the milieus in which they lived and dwelt. And of course, that imposes upon me also to understand my own milieu and my own person, my own inclinations, and my own biases and so on, and to bring all of this on the table, lay them out all flat, and then examine things with a microscope to see, what is the best explanation for all of this. So with that bit of justification, let me proceed then.
Yes. So did you when you were looking at the verse, did you look at particular words in the verse to try and understand how they were interpreted? Did you think about the verse in reference to other verses? What did you do?
Yes.
What was your approach?
I did this, and I must say as well that I benefited from the classical commentaries and from the modern attempts to reinterpret as well. And I have, in a way, pulled together bits and pieces from all of these various sources. But the most important thing, I think, Safiya, is that I looked at the context of this verse. Surah 4, verse 34 cannot be read in isolation. It has to be read in the context of verses that came before it and verses that came after it. And just the verse that comes after it, Surah 4, verse number 35, this seems to continue the discussion. Because it starts with the particle wa in Arabic, which means and. So it's continuing the discussion. It's saying and this. So Surah 4, verse 34 basically has been interpreted to mean that a man is being told that if his wife is recalcitrant, then he should first advise her. Then if she doesn't listen, then keep some distance from her in terms of intimacy. And then finally, if she's still not listening, then beat her. But the next verse says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِقَاقَ بَيْنِهِمَا, and if you fear a breach between the two of them, then appoint an arbiter, one from his family and one from her family, so that if they desire reconciliation, then they will be reconciled, and this is better in the end. And God is knowing, and He is aware. So the verse, Surah 4, verse 34, which is the problematic verse that we're trying to explain, says, وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ, as for those whose recalcitrance you fear. And then the very next verse says, and if you fear. You see the continuation, right? You fear, you, and if you fear. So the you here is the same you. Whoever is being addressed with you, like you fear and you fear, is the same you. This is very clear. So when we come to the second verse, that is the Surah 4, verse 35, all of the classical commentators agree that the you here who is being addressed, this is either the whole Muslim community as a collective, or the imam or the leader of the community as a representative of the community. Because who's going to appoint the arbiter to settle a dispute between the husband and the wife?
It has to be someone other than the husband or the wife.
Other than the husband and the wife, right? So that means that when we go back to Surah 4, verse 34, we realize it is not the husbands who are being addressed. It is the same leader of the community or the community as a whole that is being addressed. And then the whole thing makes sense, perfect sense, because now this ties in with what came before as well. In Surah 4, verse number 29, that is just a few verses before 34, about 5 verses or so before this one, it addresses the Muslim community as a whole. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe. It is an address to the whole Muslim community. And that address did not change. It continued from verse 29 all the way down, and it's still the same addressee in verse number 35. So clearly then, the addressee in verse number 34 is not husbands, but to the whole Muslim community, alladhina amanu, those who believe. So the whole Muslim community is to ensure certain things are being done. And Surah 4, verse 34 is listing one of the things that the community has to ensure. That's why it starts out by saying, Ar-rijalu qawwamuna ala nisa. Men are to be protectors and maintainers of women. So the community has to ensure that. This is where something like alimony and maintenance and so on comes in modern parlance. It's the community that has to ensure that a man is fulfilling his marital and domestic financial responsibilities. So the community has to ensure that the men are actually paying up. They're looking after their women folk, who could be their wives, their sisters, their daughters, and so on. So the men have this responsibility, and then the righteous women are to guard in privacy that which God would have them guard. It's not necessarily women who are married. Righteous women may not be married, but they could still be righteous. So then, how do we understand then the 3-step approach? First, advise them, and then abandon them in their beds, and then third, beat them. Well, once we understand that this is an address to the Muslim community as a whole, and we interpret this verse in the light of what came before it, another dimension must be added here before I come to the conclusion. So please bear with me. Another dimension is what you have been drawing attention to in our previous discussions of this verse, the question of nushuz. What is meant by nushuz, which we have translated tentatively as recalcitrance. And we've explained that the classical commentators saw this as any kind of disobedience on the part of the wife. So now this term nushuz needs to be linked with other discussions in this verse that already preceded, and in this surah that already preceded. And we can already see that in Surah 4, the same surah, verses number 14 and 15, sexual impropriety is being spoken about and how to deal with people who have committed acts of lewdness. With women in particular, if they commit acts of lewdness, then they might be placed under house arrest. So this is one aspect of this. Now, this whole idea of sexual impropriety is continuing in a thread of discourse throughout the surah until we get to verse number 34. Because we look at, for example, we were dealing with verses 14 and 15. Verse number 19 says that you're to live with your wives in decency and kindness, and you're not to take back anything that you have already given them in terms of a dower, except if they commit acts of lewdness. Then, of course, the marriage breaks down in a very different way, and whatever the man has given, he deserves his. If you can well imagine a man has given an ample dower to his wife. The next day, his wife commits an act of lewdness. She's sleeping around. Then, really, it was not a valid marriage to be. I mean, it's valid technically, but it was not real for the man. And he spent his money. He needs to get his money back. He can then recover what he has spent in that marriage, because it's not his fault. So we see the sexual impropriety, the idea of sexual impropriety continuing. In verse number 25, we are being told, actually from verse number 23 onwards, who you can and who you cannot get married to, and what would be sexually inappropriate. And then verse number 25, if you marry the slave women, but then they commit acts of lewdness, then they get half the penalty of that which would have been imposed upon a free woman. So it's about the idea of sexual impropriety continues throughout this whole discussion, just a few verses above this one. Now, what was the way of dealing with sexual impropriety for both men and women? In Surah 24, verse number 2, they might be lashed 100 lashes if they committed adultery. So we see in Surah 4, there's a reference to this, that the slave women will be given only half the penalty of that would be given to free women. So we are seeing that it's sexual impropriety that's being spoken about. Now come back to Surah 4, verse number 34, which is the verse that mentions the beating. So when we realize now that sexual impropriety is the problem, we can understand the term nushuz in the light of that, and say that what the Quran is speaking about here is, in the case of a woman committing an act of lewdness, what do you do? Now, if the act of lewdness is of that level where she has clearly committed adultery, then she will get the penalty that's mentioned in the 24th surah of the Quran in the second verse, which is 100 lashes. I'm not saying let's do that today. I'm trying to understand the verse, what it meant in the classical context. And then we can think about how to apply it today. But the point here is not about the lashes. The point is about, can we get away from this idea of men beating women, beating their wives, and linking that to this verse? And the answer from me is yes, we get away from that idea, and this is how. By understanding that the Muslim community is being told that if women in particular, we'll come to men in a moment, because it's even Steven, it's for both men and women, each get their penalties if they commit certain crimes.
Okay, I was going to ask you that, because it seems like there's a great emphasis on women's sexual impropriety.
In this particular verse, yes. And in this, in the earlier part of the surah, and in Surah 4, verse number 14 and 15, we have a differentiation where both men and women are to be given penalties, but it's only the woman who is given the penalty to stay at home. And we might ask, okay, what's the difference? Well, in that society, men were generally the breadwinners. If the man was forced to stay at home, if as a penalty for his sexual sins, he was to be kept under house arrest, then the whole family will suffer because they would lose their breadwinner. But if the woman was being told, okay, stay at home, well, that's what women generally did anyway. They stayed at home, and it's just that it's in a more supervised way to say, now this is a requirement. Normally, women could go out for their needs. They could go out shopping. They could go out to see their friends. They can visit family and whatever. But now, because a woman going out has been part of the problem, a particular woman has been going out and using her going out for the purpose of committing sexual sins, well, now she is being placed under house arrest. So now, coming back to Surah 4, verse number 34, we see that the same house arrest, which was being mentioned in Surah 4, verse number 14 and 15, or rather 15 and 16, Surah 4, verse 15 and 16, the same house arrest is being spoken about here as well. That's the وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ. Leave them in their places of dwelling. Well, they're sleeping quarters, basically, but sleeping quarters in those times were almost the whole house, okay, because the houses were not as big as we have them now, and, separated with many different rooms and dining room and den and all of that. So that's how I would understand وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ means, keep them under quarantine in their places of dwelling. And then if that too does not solve the problem, well, then the last stage will be the beating, which is mentioned in Surah 24, verse number 2, and that is beating for both men and women if they commit sexual crimes. Now, let's take it systematically, step by step, and see the three stages. The first stage was advise them. Second stage, now I'm saying have them under house arrest, which is already mentioned in Surah 4, in the same surah, in verses number 15 and 16. And then the third stage is the beating, which is mentioned in Surah 24. So we're bringing all of these passages of the Quran together on the same subject matter, and one interprets and explains the other. So let's give a real and practical example of how these three stages might play out in a real situation. So suppose a woman is standing in what might be called in modern times a red light district. So she might be given a ticket, which is a warning. So that's a warning. فَإِذُوهُنَّ. Then let's say now she is still doing that. Well, then the next stage might be to say, okay, you're under house arrest. I'm not saying that this is a modern law, but, we can see it playing out something like this in a modern context. All right, so now she's placed under house arrest, so she can't go anymore to that red light district. But let's say she's bringing the business to her home now. She's taking it up a notch, and naturally the law has to step in further, and that would be the last stage, which would be the corporal punishment for her. Again, how this might play out in a modern context, this needs some further interpretation, but we're talking about the classical position, like what did the Quran mean when it said what it said at that time and in that place, in that context. So now it is
we still have to think about how to apply it in our current
context. But now, at least with this interpretation, I feel quite comfortable that we have moved away from the idea that this verse means that a man could beat his wife. The verse doesn't mean that. For it to mean that, it has to be an address to the men. It has to be saying, oh, you men, if you fear that your wives are being disobedient to you, this is what you do. But the verse doesn't say that. The classical commentators, like you can see at Tabari, rendering it this way: Ayyuhar rijal, or you men, as if the Quran is speaking to men and using these words, but the Quran didn't use these words.
So why do you think they all made this mistake?
Well, they made this mistake because, as you indicated before with a previous question in a previous segment, we're all subject to our own social circumstances. We think certain things to be normal because of the time and place in which we live. They thought certain things to be normal. They thought it's kind of normal for a man to beat his wife, and they interpreted the verses in that way. And then I wanted to expand a little bit more. I don't know how much time you have.
Just a bit.
on the idea that men get their penalties as well.
Yes, let's talk about that, because this is a lingering question in my mind.
And this is one of the things that is a big lacuna in the classical commentators, because the same surah we're talking about, Surah 4, in verse number 128, 28 says, وَإِنْ خَافَتْ مِنْ بَعْلِهَا وَإِنْ امْرَأَةٌ خَافَتْ مِنْ بَعْلِهَا نُشُوزًا أَوْ إِعْرَاضًا. If a woman fears nushuz, the same word that sounds like new shoes, the same word nushuz is mentioned. If a woman fears nushuz or turning away. If a woman fears that her husband is committing nushuz, I'm keeping the Arabic word here so we can expound it and give it right to you. Or if the woman fears that her husband is committing nushuz or turning away from her, then there is no harm if the two of them make a reconciliation among themselves, okay? Now, when they come to explain the nushuz of the wife, which we have translated as recalcitrance or disobedience, they say, well, it means that a woman is not supposed to go over her husband, because the literal meaning of the word nashaza means to rise above. So now, if that's the meaning, what do we say when we come to the husband? If the husband is naturally above the wife, according to their explanation, then what would his nushuz constitute? How could he be putting on airs or trying to rise above the wife if he's already naturally, even more than naturally, if he already has the God-given right, according to these interpreters, to be over his wife? So that means that their explanation of nushuz, when they came to explain that in terms of the woman's actions, is lopsided.
Mm-hmm.
It's one-sided, like it's against the woman. It's in favor of a man. So the man could be committing nushuz. So what would be the nushuz that would be equally balanced if a man does it or a woman does it? It's sexual impropriety.
Mm.
So then that would explain Surah 4, verse 128. If a woman fears that her husband is having an illicit relationship, or he is turning away from her, then she now has the opportunity to try and make right with her husband. So they can try to reach some kind of reconciliation here. They can talk it over and try to reach a solution to that. So the same thing was there in Surah 4, verse number 34. If there is some nushuz or sexual impropriety on the part of the woman, in this case, it is the Muslim community as a whole that is being addressed and asked to step in and to deal with this recalcitrant wife by giving the 3 steps. And it's not necessarily wife. It could be any woman in Surah 4, verse number 34, because as we said, a woman may not be married, but she could be committing this act of sexual impropriety. The 3 stages: first advice, then homestay, and then the third thing would be the corporal punishment in that social context.
We'll leave it at that, Dr. Shabir. Thank you for sharing your take on this verse.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe, and please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.